only the present and the future, but it even changes the past, because the past has to be retrospectively brought into line with some kind of new national narrative.
Segment 3, civilizational exhaustion. Again, America alone. Quote, a suicide bomber may be a weak weapon, but not against a weak culture. Explain that.
Yeah, essentially, Islam has bet that we have expensive toys. We've got the best kind of aircraft carriers. We've got the best kind of tanks. We've got the smart bombs. And that's a short-term advantage. If you want to pick a fight on a battlefield, if you want to pick a fight that is slightly more ambiguous, that never actually calls out the force you're up against onto the battlefield for a big tank battle, then what matters is will. What matters is will. And they have bet that the West does not have the will to defend itself. And they see that every day of the week. For example, in the way Comedy Central just a couple of days ago caved in and censored the show South Park. I don't really know much about South Park. I don't watch it particularly. I don't have a TV reception worth speaking of. But one thing I do know is that 10 years ago, South Park was able to do a Muhammad joke, and it went on the air, and it was broadcast, and nobody threatened to kill anybody over it. Right. What has happened since then is that we have taught these people the lesson that if you threaten to kill and you threaten to murder and you threaten to intimidate, you don't actually have to kill or murder anyone. The culture will just cave anyway.
All right. You identify a couple of sources of this civilizational exhaustion. Let me try to ask you for an explanation of each. Again, I'm quoting from America Alone. Most mainline Protestant churches are to one degree or another post-Christian. They hold, actually I'm quoting this sentence just because I love the sentence. Deep breath. They hold that if Jesus were alive today, he'd most likely be a gay Anglican bishop in a committed relationship, driving around in an environmentally friendly car with an arms are for hugging sticker. Close quote. The West is exhausted because it has ceased to believe.
Well, I think it has ceased to believe in anything. And by that I mean it's not necessary for everyone in a Western nation to be a believing and observant Christian. Mm-hmm. But you have to understand, I think, that your civilization springs from a relatively narrow foundational source. I find it, I like atheists, but I must say I find the quality of atheism has deteriorated dramatically over the last century. If you go back to the late 19th century when Nietzsche declared that God is dead, he at least respected God enough to want to pick a fight over his existence or not. That's something slightly more sophisticated than if you look at Richard Dawkins or, for example, Christopher Hitchens, a smart guy, a man I like very much, yes. A man who is on the right side of most things. But Christopher Hitchens says religion poisons everything. I don't understand how you can look at most of the great artwork of Western civilization. I don't understand how you can listen to Mozart or Brahms and say that. It's not necessary to be an observant Christian to hear the beauty in a great European requiem mass that springs from that Christian tradition. And so the idea of trashing our civilization in the interests of, I think, a multicultural nullity, I think has been a disaster. And I think it's left a great big hole where our identity ought to be.
Second cause of civilizational exhaustion, you argue, and I quote again from America Alone, quote, the populations of wealthy democratic societies expect to have total choice over their satellite TV packages, yet think it perfectly normal to allow the state to make all the choices in respect of their health care. The torpor of the West derives in part from the annexation by government of most of the core functions of adulthood. Close quote. Explain that one.
Well, I don't think it's very difficult. I think if you take a picture of the average 13-year-old in California today, and then you take a picture of a 13-year-old from, say, my part of New Hampshire, circa 1878, just put those photographs side by side. which one would you be willing to leave your house to if you were to go away for a weekend? I don't think it's a very difficult question to answer that. Now that's fine when you're 13, but what happens when you extend adolescence? The President of the United States has just told us that if you're 26 years old, you can stay on your parents' health insurance plan. So he's basically said at 26, you're still a child.
Childhood extends to 26. Right?
On your 27th birthday, you've got to finally shape up and move out of your parents' insurance agency. But until then, you're a child. The problem with that is that I think we have essentially created a society of permanent adolescence, where the important business, healthcare, why is it that people could make their own healthcare arrangements 50, 100, 200 years ago, but that now the state has to do it for us? And what does that say about us? When you insulate people when you insulate your citizens from all the most basic pressures of life, what kind of citizenry do you wind up with? And that's why I do think we are creating essentially a society of permanent adolescence, where we talk about our iPods, we talk about the music we listen to, we talk about our cable packages, whereas everything important, the decisions are made for us by the government.
Segment 4, Steyn and his critics. The Economist magazine called your book, quote, an alarmist's creed. The Guardian, one of Britain's leading newspapers, said, quote, Steyn's book is indeed alarmist. Maclean's magazine, for which you write. Maclean's, the Canadian magazine, called the book once again alarmist. Why can't you put your argument more calmly? You have something important to say. Why not say it in a way that appeals to the intellectuals who have their hands on the levers of power?
Because I think it's actually happening so fast that if we want to do anything about it, we need to do it quickly, or the entire Western world is going to be out of business. What I find fascinating, really, after publishing the book, is that the progressive mind denies there's anything to argue about. You know, some people will pick a fight with me and say, "Oh, the idea that Europe will be Muslim by the year 2030 is absurd. Maybe by 2070 or 2100." Right. So in that case, we're not arguing about the destination. Right. We're only arguing about the length of the journey. But more and more people say, "Well, what would be so wrong? What would be so wrong if the Western world did become Muslim?" And that, I think, is the self-neutering result of the multicultural mindset. You remember Mayor Nagin in New Orleans. When it turned out that a lot of the people who'd moved away didn't want to come back, he got all worried about that because he said New Orleans has always been, quote, a chocolate city, unquote. In other words, he thought that who lived there made a difference to what the city was. Why can't you make that point about Italians in Milan? Why can't you make that point about Swedes in Malmö? Why can't you make that point about Dutch people in Rotterdam? And I think that's what I find fascinating, that the leftist progressives say, well, what's the big deal if the whole world becomes Muslim? What would be wrong with that? Right. And I think what the response to that is, well, look, you know, okay, which currently Muslim city would you want to live in?
Exactly.
I like the Muslim world. I spent a lot of time in the Muslim world. I love Amman. I love Cairo. I love visiting them. But would I want to raise a family in Cairo? Would I want to try and do business in Cairo? Would I want to try and exercise my right to free speech even in Jordan, which is a supposedly moderate Muslim state? No. I'm very happy to visit them, but I'm very happy to come home to free, pluralist Western societies.
All right, let's move on to a critic of yours who plays fair, to the extent that he certainly doesn't want all of Europe to become radical Muslim, and understands that something is at stake. Christopher Hitchens, quote, Steyn makes the same mistake as did the late Italian journalist Oriani Fallaci, considering European Muslim populations as one. Little binds a Somali to a Turk or an Iranian or an Algerian, and considerable friction exists among immigrant Muslim groups. Argument 1. Argument 2. Moreover, many Muslims actually have come to Europe for the advertised purposes, seeking asylum and to build a better life. Close quote. calm down. Those 40% in Antwerp don't get along that well with each other in the first place, and some of them are there because it's Antwerp. They get to be less Muslim and more secular.
Well, I think the way to look at that is, with respect to Christopher Hitchens, is I think that was true a couple of generations back. I think, for example, if you take a Pakistani immigrant to Scotland, that just happens to be an example, a real-life example I happen to know, 1950.
Right.
That Pakistani immigrant to Scotland would have had a broadly similar education to the guy in Scotland. So in other words, he's coming to a land that he has been raised, in a sense, to live in. He is coming to the imperial metropolis from the fringe. So he already comes semi-assimilated. Now you take a Pakistani immigrant who comes in the year 2010. He'll have been educated in a madrasa. He'll know Islam, but not much else. He's far more foreign in that sense to Scotland than he would have been 50 or 60 years ago. But also I think there is a difference. And this is where the numbers come into play, that was simply not possible to live in a Muslim world in inner city Scotland in 1950, whereas it is now. What you see in Malmö, Sweden, where Jews are fleeing, in the most progressive society in Europe, social democratic Scandinavia, Jews have concluded there's no future for them in Malmö, and they're getting the hell out of there. Why? Because it's a Muslim city, and in a sense, there are so many Muslims in Malmö that Sweden has assimilated with Islam rather than the other way around. So I think with respect to Christopher Hitchens, he profoundly overestimates Westernization. And Christopher should know this. There's a fascinating series of pictures that was published on the internet a couple of months ago, showing the female graduating class from Cairo University in 1958, 1979, and I think 2004. 1958, they're all bareheaded women. They look like young women, more or less not terribly different from young women you would have seen at the time in Western Europe or anywhere else. By 1979, half of them are covered. 2004, they're all covered. It's the arrogance, I think. It's the arrogance even of the left to assume that the societal pull is always in the direction of Westernization. In the Muslim world, that is not the case. It's gone backwards, and I think you can see evidence already that it's going backwards in northern England and other heavily Muslim parts of Europe.
Segment 5, your title, America Alone. You sum up European disdain for the United States by quoting the British journalist Brian Reed, who writes that Americans are, quote, self-righteous, gun-toting, military-loving, sister-marrying, abortion-hating, gay-loathing, foreigner-despising, non-passport-owning rednecks. To which Mark Steyn replies...
I think you left out the most colourful bit of that description.
Well, there's a bit that's...
rather vivid mixturitions.
Go ahead, toss it in.
Yeah, who think that I think God gave them the biggest manhood in the world. I'm being discreet there,
yes,
so that they could urinate on the rest of the planet. It's something like that.
To which Mark Steyn replies, if one were to formulate it less disapprovingly, Brian Reed's Anatomy of Americans equals, quoting you now, culturally confident, self-reliant, patriotic, procreative, religious, democratic, constitutional rednecks who believe in national sovereignty rather than ineffectual poseur multilateralism. Close